Welcome to History Told, the show where history, media, and culture intersect. Today's episode is about contradiction, specifically one of the largest contradictions in modern popular culture: environmental cinema. It's become one of the most influential ways that people encounter environmental issues. For many audiences, films are their first introduction to ideas about climate change, conservation, extinction, environmental justice, ecological collapse. Movies teach audiences how to imagine nature. They teach viewers what counts as wilderness, who belongs in nature, who threatens it, and what kind of environmental futures seem possible. But there's a paradox here. The same film industry producing emotionally powerful environmental messages is also deeply tied to systems of consumption, industrial production, tourism, fossil fuel dependence. Hollywood tells us to save the planet while flying massive crews across continents. Studios warn audiences about ecological collapse while constructing enormous disposable sets. Disaster films profit from the spectacle of environmental destruction itself. So today, we're examining this central argument. Environmental cinema both challenges and reinforces dominant attitudes toward nature, and exists within an industry that hypocritically advocates for environmental change while also causing and profiting from ecological disasters itself. This episode approaches environmental cinema through the lens of environmental history. That means we're not just asking, what environmental message does this movie contain? We're also asking, what historical ideas about nature does it reproduce? What economic systems make these films possible? How does cinema shape public environmental consciousness? And how can Hollywood genuinely critique ecological destruction while remaining part of the industrial systems driving it? Today we'll explore the historical origins of environmental cinema, how films challenge industrial and capitalist ideas about nature, how they simultaneously reinforce colonial and consumerist assumptions, the environmental costs of filmmaking itself, disaster cinema and the commodification of ecological collapse, and finally, children's environmental films, which introduced ecological ethics to entire generations. Before discussing contradictions, we first need to define environmental cinema itself. Environmental cinema is broader than documentaries about climate change. It includes any film where nature, ecology, environmental conflict plays a central role. That includes wildlife documentaries, post apocalyptic climate fiction, animated children's films, eco horror, westerns, science fiction, conservation films, indigenous land rights cinema, disaster films. In many ways, cinema has always been environmental. From the earliest days of filmmaking, landscapes were central attractions. Early audiences were fascinated by moving images of waterfalls, mountains, forests, oceans. Nature became spectacle almost immediately, and that matters historically. Environmental historians argue that the modern idea of nature is culturally constructed. Wilderness isn't simply a physical reality, it's also an imagined category shaped by art, politics, tourism, photography, cinema. Film doesn't merely depict nature, film actively creates environmental meaning. For example, American cinema has historically portrayed nature in several recurring ways. Nature is frontier. Particularly in westerns, land is presented as open territory, waiting for settlement and development. This reflects 19th century frontier ideology and Manifest Destiny. Nature as escape. Modern urban audiences are shown forests, oceans, and mountains as places of spiritual renewal. Nature as threat. Horror and disaster films frequently portray nature as dangerous, uncontrollable, or vengeful. And finally, nature as victim. Environmental cinema increasingly depicts ecosystems under assault from humanity. These categories overlap constantly. One film may portray nature as sacred, while simultaneously presenting it as a consumable visual experience. And that contradiction is central to environmental cinema. Another important point to make is that film changes how audiences physically experience landscapes they may never visit. Before mass media, most people understood distant ecosystems through written descriptions, paintings, local experiences. Cinema transformed that relationship entirely. Film allowed audiences to quote unquote travel visually to deserts, rainforests, polar regions, oceans, even outer space. This visual access changed environmental perception. Nature became increasingly mediated through screens. And this matters because cinematic nature is not neutral. Landscapes are framed, edited, scored with music, and they're emotionally coded. A forest filmed with bright lighting and uplifting music communicates serenity. The same forest filmed with dark shadows and ominous sound design communicates danger. Cinema teaches viewers how to emotionally interpret environments. This can often connect to tourism as well. Films influence where people travel and how they consume landscapes. After certain films become popular, tourism to natural areas often increases dramatically. Ironically, movies celebrating pristine wilderness can contribute to environmental degradation through mass visitation. This creates another contradiction. Cinema encourages appreciation for nature while simultaneously increasing human pressure on fragile ecosystems. Environmental cinema also plays a role in constructing national identity. In the United States, especially, landscapes have historically been tied to ideas about freedom, masculinity, independence, and national identity. Think about the recurring imagery in American film: Monument Valley in westerns, expansive plains, towering mountains, endless highways. These environments aren't just backgrounds, they become symbols of America itself. Environmental historians argue that this landscape mythology helped justify westward expansion and resource extraction. Cinema inherited and amplified those myths. Even contemporary environmental films often rely on romantic imagery rooted in earlier frontier traditions. So, environmental cinema isn't simply about ecology, it's also about memory and nationalism and identity. Environmental cinema expanded dramatically during the late 20th century. Several historical events shaped this shift: the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the rise of the modern environmental movement, Earth Day, oil spills and industrial disasters, growing awareness of climate change, the expansion of environmental documentaries. Cinema increasingly reflected public anxiety about ecological crisis. By the 1970s and 1980s, environmental concerns became mainstream themes in popular culture. But importantly, these films emerged within capitalist entertainment industries. Environmental awareness itself became marketable. Studios realized ecological themes could generate emotional engagement, appeal to younger audiences, create moral prestige, open merchandising opportunities. Environmentalism became both activism and branding, and that paradox persists even today. Despite its contradictions, environmental cinema genuinely challenges dominant ideas about nature. Many films directly criticize industrial capitalism, pollution, militarism, or consumer culture. One major theme is the critique of extraction. Environmental films repeatedly question the assumption that nature exists solely for human use. Forests aren't merely timber reserves. Animals aren't simply resources. Land isn't just property. This represents a major shift from older industrial ideologies. Historically, industrial societies often treated nature as infinite and endlessly exploitable. Environmental cinema disrupts that worldview. Another key idea is ecological interconnectedness. Films increasingly emphasize that environmental systems are linked. Oceans affect climate, deforestation affects biodiversity, pollution affects human health. This systems-based thinking reflects modern ecological science. Environmental films encourage audiences to see themselves not as separate from nature, but embedded within it, part of it. That's historically significant because industrial modernity often encouraged the opposite perspective. Some films also foreground environmental inequality. Pollution and ecological destruction don't affect all communities equally. Environmental justice narratives emphasize indigenous land rights, toxic exposure, resource colonialism, climate inequality. This broadens environmentalism beyond wilderness preservation into questions of power and justice. Cinema is especially effective because it works emotionally. Statistics rarely move audiences the way stories do. Environmental films can use music, visual spectacle, character identification, even fear, nostalgia, or grief to produce ecological feelings. And this emotional power can shape public consciousness profoundly. But emotion can also simplify complex problems. Another major strength of environmental cinema is its ability to visualize slow-moving crises. There's a challenge to discussing the representation of environmental change because many ecological processes occur gradually. There's rising temperatures, biodiversity loss, soil erosion, ocean acidification. These changes are difficult for humans to perceive in everyday life. Cinema can compress time. Through editing or montage or visual effects, films can make invisible environmental processes visible and emotionally immediate. This is one reason climate fiction and environmental documentaries have become increasingly important. They translate abstract scientific concepts into emotionally understandable narratives. Documentary filmmaking, in particular, has played a major role in environmental activism. Environmental documentaries often function as both journalism and advocacy. They expose pollution, habitat destruction, industrial farming, climate change, corporate negligence. But documentaries aren't just objective windows into reality, they're carefully constructed narratives. Editing choices, music, camera angles, and narration shape audience interpretation. Environmental documentaries, therefore, occupy an interesting position historically. They claim scientific authority while simultaneously relying on emotional persuasion. This combination can be extremely powerful. In many cases, documentaries have shaped public debate more effectively than academic research alone. Environmental cinema also struggles with a recurring emotional dilemma. How do filmmakers portray ecological crisis without overwhelming audiences? Too much optimism can feel dishonest. Too much despair can produce hopelessness. Many films oscillate between apocalyptic warning and cautious hope. Environmental historians sometimes refer to this as the politics of environmental emotion. Fear may attract attention initially, but sustained engagement often requires some vision of possible change. This emotional balancing act shapes nearly every environmental film produced today. Environmental cinema often critiques dominant systems while quietly reinforcing them. This is where environmental history becomes especially useful, because historians ask not only what a film says, but what assumptions it leaves unquestioned. One major contradiction is the transformation of ecological catastrophe into entertainment spectacle. Think of films with wildfires, floods, collapsing cities, mass extinctions. Environmental destruction becomes visually thrilling. Audiences consume catastrophe as entertainment. Disaster cinema profits from ecological anxiety while simultaneously normalizing it. This can create emotional distance. Instead of mobilizing action, spectacle can produce passivity. Environmental collapse becomes something viewers watch rather than something they can confront politically. Even environmentally conscious films often center humanity above nature. Humans remain the protagonists, the moral decision makers, ultimately the saviors. Nature frequently exists in relation to human destiny, and this reinforces anthropocentrism, the belief that humans are the center of ecological meaning. Many environmental films portray wilderness as empty or untouched, but environmental historians emphasize that so-called wilderness areas were often inhabited and managed by indigenous peoples long before colonization. Cinema frequently erases those histories. This reproduces colonial ideas about land ownership and conservation. Nature becomes something to preserve from humanity rather than something humans have always lived within. Perhaps the most important contradiction is the focus on individual consumer behavior. Environmental films often suggest for people to buy differently or recycle more, consume ethically. But systemic issues like corporate power, fossil fuel infrastructure, and global capitalism receive less attention. Environmental responsibility becomes individualized. This fits neatly within consumer capitalism. Even environmental awareness becomes another market identity. And another contradiction involves technology and industry. Many environmental films criticize industrial society while simultaneously presenting technological innovation as the ultimate solution to ecological crisis. This creates what can sometimes be called the technological optimism. The underlying assumption becomes human ingenuity will eventually solve environmental problems without requiring major political or economic transformation. In these narratives, cleaner machines, renewable energy, or advanced science become substitutes for structural change. Technology is portrayed as capable of saving humanity from the consequences of industrial modernity itself. This perspective can minimize deeper critiques of consumption and economic growth. Environmental cinema also commodifies nature aesthetically. Beautiful landscapes become selling points. Studios market scenic cinematography, exotic ecosystems, immersive environmental visuals. Nature itself becomes part of the product. This reflects a broader historical pattern within capitalism. Even anti consumerist messages can become commodities. environmental concern becomes marketable. Audiences consume environmental awareness through entertainment products, streaming platforms, merchandise, tourism. This doesn't necessarily invalidate environmental films, but it complicates their political role. Another important dimension is celebrity activism. Hollywood celebrities frequently advocate for environmental causes. This can increase visibility for ecological issues dramatically, but critics argue celebrity environmentalism sometimes transforms collective political struggles into individualized branding opportunities. Environmental activism becomes associated with lifestyle, moral identity, personal image. These can unintentionally depoliticize environmental issues by emphasizing symbolic gestures over systemic transformation. Again, contradiction remains central. Environmental cinema raises awareness, but often within frameworks compatible with consumer culture or corporate branding. And nowhere is environmental messaging more culturally influential than in children's films. For many people, their earliest environmental ideas didn't come from classrooms, but from animated movies. Children's environmental cinema is fascinating because it simplifies complex ecological issues into moral narratives. Nature becomes emotionally legible. Good and evil become clearer, and environmental ethics become tied to childhood identity formation. So let's begin with Fern Gully, The Last Rainforest. Released in 1992, Fern Gully presents one of the clearest anti-deforestation messages in mainstream animation. The film portrays rainforests as sacred ecosystems, industrial logging as destructive, and pollution as an existential threat. The villain, Hexus, is literally pollution embodied and voiced by the incomparable Tim Curry. The environmental message is explicit. Industrial capitalism threatens ecological balance. But even here, contradictions emerge. The rainforest is depicted as mystical and untouched, reinforcing romanticized wilderness imagery. Humanity appears primarily as destroyer or outsider. Indigenous ecological relationships to forests are largely absent. And then there's WALL-E. And I speak from authority on this one. WALL-E is my 4-year-old's favorite film, so I have watched it a lot. It's perhaps one of the most important environmental films for modern audiences. The opening images are striking. Endless garbage towers, abandoned cities, environmental collapse caused by hyperconsumerism. The film critiques waste culture, corporate monopolies, automation, environmental neglect. It's one of the most direct critiques of consumer capitalism ever produced by a major animation studio. And yet, WALL-E itself became an enormous merchandising success. Toys, brand partnerships, consumer products. A movie criticizing consumption became part of consumer culture. That contradiction perfectly encapsulates environmental cinema itself. Children's films shape ecological values early. These films teach empathy toward animals, suspicion of pollution, emotional attachment to ecosystems, environmental stewardship. But they also tend to simplify environmental politics into individual morality. Villains are evil corporations or careless individuals, not systems. Solutions often come through personal transformation rather than structural change. Still, their influence is undeniable. Entire generations developed environmental awareness through animated storytelling, Again, I'm victim or hero of this myself. Was I raised on Captain Planet on television? Absolutely. Did they simplify the story of pollution and environmental change? Yes. Do I still think they should make a Captain Planet movie for all of us to nostalgically go attend? Absolutely. Children's environmental films are especially important because they shape environmental consciousness before audiences fully understand politics or economics. These movies often function as moral education. Children learn pollution is harmful, ecosystems deserve protection, greed can damage nature, animals possess emotional value. These messages become foundational ethical assumptions later in life. And importantly, children's films tend to personalize environmental relationships. Environmental problems become emotionally intimate rather than abstract. A child may not understand climate science, but they understand sadness when a forest is destroyed or empathy when an animal suffers. Animation is particularly effective at this because it anthropomorphizes nature. Animals, robots, trees, ecosystems all gain personalities and emotional agency. This encourages identification with non-human life. These films also become part of generational environmental memory. Adults who watch environmental films as children often carry these emotional experiences into adulthood. Memory plays a huge role in environmental politics. People fight to preserve what they feel emotionally attached to. Children's cinema helps create those attachments. For many millennials and Gen Z viewers, films like Ferngully, Wall-E, The Lorax, Princess Mononoke formed part of their ecological worldview. However, simplification remains a major issue. Children's films often portray environmental destruction through clear villains, such as evil corporations, careless humans, greedy developers. Reality is usually far more structurally complex. Climate change, pollution, extraction, these are all embedded in global economic systems, not simply individual morality. But children's media often relies on moral clarity because it is pedagogically effective. This tension between accessibility and complexity defines much of environmental storytelling for younger audiences. And now we confront the industry itself, because filmmaking in and of itself is an industrial process. Large productions consume enormous resources: electricity, fuel, transportation, construction materials, catering waste, water, digital infrastructure. Productions often fly crews internationally while transporting equipment across continents. Temporary sets are frequently demolished after filming. Streaming infrastructure itself consumes significant energy through data centers and digital transmission. Environmental messaging exists within an environmentally costly medium. Hollywood has also historically profited directly from environmental catastrophe. Disaster films transform ecological fear into spectacle and revenue. Climate anxiety becomes monetized entertainment. The industry simultaneously warns about ecological collapse, contributes to emissions, and profits from environmental fear. That contradiction isn't accidental. It reflects capitalism's remarkable ability to commodify even criticism of itself. Studios increasingly market sustainability initiatives, carbon offsets, green production certifications, eco-friendly branding. Some reforms are meaningful, but critics argue these efforts often function as public relations strategies more than structural transformation. Hollywood wants environmental credibility without fundamentally altering industrial practices. And this mirrors broader patterns in corporate environmentalism. Streaming has introduced another layer to the environmental conversation. Many people assume digital media is environmentally cleaner than physical production and distribution. But streaming relies on massive data infrastructure, servers, cooling systems, cloud storage, global internet networks. Data centers consume enormous amounts of electricity. So even watching environmental films at home carries hidden environmental costs. The environmental footprint of media increasingly extends beyond film sets into global digital infrastructure. Modern filmmaking is also highly globalized. Productions move internationally to reduce labor costs, access tax incentives, or film in visually dramatic environments. This globalization increases transportation emissions significantly. At the same time, environmental damage caused during production often affects local communities more than studios themselves. Environmental historians frequently emphasize that environmental costs are unevenly distributed. Hollywood profits are centralized. Environmental impacts are often localized elsewhere. This raises a difficult final question. Can environmental cinema still matter politically despite these contradictions? I would argue yes, but critically. Environmental films are not meaningless because they are contradictory. In fact, contradiction may be what makes them historically valuable. They reveal the tensions of contemporary environmental consciousness, awareness without systemic transformation, critique within capitalism, ecological concern tied to consumer culture. Environmental cinema reflects the anxieties and limitations of the society producing it. And that makes it an incredibly important source for environmental historians studying the modern world. Environmental cinema matters because it reveals the contradictions of modern society itself. We live in a world increasingly aware of ecological crisis, yet deeply dependent on the systems producing it. Environmental films challenge audiences to rethink humanity's relationship with nature, but they also emerge from industries tied to consumption, extraction, profit. That paradox can't simply be resolved. And perhaps it shouldn't be, because the contradiction itself is historically revealing. Environmental cinema is not outside industrial society. It's one of the clearest reflections of it. So when we watch environmental films, we should ask, what environmental values are being promoted? What assumptions about nature remain unchallenged? Who benefits from these narratives? And what kinds of environmental futures are being imagined? Environmental cinema can inspire change, but it can also commodify ecological anxiety. It can challenge systems of power while remaining embedded within them. And that paradox may be the defining feature of environmental media in the modern age. Thanks for listening to History Retold. Join us next time as we continue exploring the intersections of history, media, and culture. And if you happen to be listening to this while driving to or from Big Bend, be sure to drive safely.